You're listening to The Conversation. A little after 2 p.m. on the 8th of April, the Israeli military hit more than 100 targets in Lebanon in just 10 minutes.
Massive destruction in the heart of Beirut, in the centre and the west of the city, bustling residential and commercial districts.
Israel called the attack Operation Eternal Darkness and said it struck Hezbollah command and control centres across Lebanon. The Lebanese government said at least 300 people were killed and 1,000 injured. It's been called Black Wednesday. The scale of the attack on Lebanon was reminiscent of the early days of the Gaza War in 2023, when Israel retaliated for the October the 7th attacks with waves of aerial bombardment of Gaza. Israel has a powerful and lethal army, and it's been defending itself against attacks from Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran. But why has it chosen such brutal military aggression? One historian, Peleg, believes the answer to this question lies in the early days of Zionism in the 19th century, when many Jews who arrived in Palestine were fleeing anti-Semitism in Europe. In defiance, they began a cultural revolution, emphasising military strength and honouring biblical Jewish heroes. But in the wake of the Holocaust, Peleg thinks Israel's view of itself began to change.
And there started a really problematic combination of defiance, aggression, and a sense of victimhood. And it's a very explosive and lethal combination.
I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. Today, how Israel's self-image changed from self-reliance to aggressive militarism, and how that history helps to explain the way it wages war today. Yaron Peleg, you're a professor of modern Hebrew studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK, where you research the stories Israel tells about itself through literature, film, and culture. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
We're going to start in mid-19th century Europe. Take me back to that time. It's a period of surging nationalism and a difficult time to be a member of a minority. What kind of portrayals of Jews are circulating at that time?
Jews were in fact invited to join the forming nations of Europe in their various countries of residence towards the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th. But that initial phase was relatively short, and what followed is what I would say proximity bred contempt, in the sense that as the Jews tried to assimilate and become part of these new national entities that formed, a new animosity developed towards them, eventually was labeled anti-Semitism. Certain stereotypes were connected with them. And these were primarily the negative stereotypes: cowards, craven, passive, unmanly, effeminate, etc., etc. But being Jewish in 19th century Europe was very different for different people in different places, from west to east, with west being France primarily, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany as sort of relatively easier. And then you get to the so-called Pale of Settlement, which was an area that stretched diagonally across Europe from the Baltic to the Black Sea, most of which was under Tsarist Russian rule. And the Jews there were progressively squished into this stretch and had a hard time making a living. They also were progressively oppressed by the Tsarist regime through bouts of violence, and the Jews there suffered probably the most in Europe. And between 1880 and 1924, between 2 and 3 million Jews left the continent to settle primarily in North America, but also in other British colonies around the world.
By the 1880s, the first Zionists began moving to Palestine from Europe. Tell me about that, and what were they aiming to do?
We're talking about a period before the formal formation of what we now call Zionism. The problems that I have described caused a number of Jews to try to think of various solutions. Immigration, of course, was a personal solution, because when you emigrate as an individual, as a family, you really take care of your own self, and that's it. But what some Jewish leaders, some intellectuals wanted to do is to offer a communal solution to Jews. And one of these solutions was the proto-Zionist cultural movement that was called in Hebrew Chibat Zion, or Love of Zion. And they established a whole system of clubs, cultural clubs, mostly in Eastern Europe, Romania, and all the way to the Baltics. And they were focused primarily on the ancient Jewish political history. And they wanted to emphasize the vitality, the dynamism, and the heroism of ancient Jews, primarily in the Bible. And as part of their efforts, they also advocated for people to move to Palestine, buy land there, and become farmers. In the 1880s, around 30,000 Jews moved to Palestine. These were fairly affluent people who used their own money to buy tracts of land in Palestine that were available and establish communal farms or private farms, but they simply wanted to change the way that they perceived of Jewish life. It also had to do not necessarily just with Jews, with ameliorative trends in Europe that called on cultivating your body, going back to nature, to the soil. This is the environment around them in Russia, in Germany, even in the United Kingdom, advocated these kinds of cleansing or purifying trends. And the specific Jewish interpretation they gave it was going to Palestine and becoming farmers. They didn't necessarily think of themselves on the way to establish Jewish sovereignty. That's not how they thought. It was only in the late 1890s, with the arrival of Theodor Herzl and his articulation of establishing a Jewish entity there, that movement came into a much clearer sort of focus and understanding of what he wants to do and having a vision, a political vision. Theodor Herzl was a Hungarian Jew, was born in Budapest, which was at the time part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in which Jews enjoyed, as a minority, relatively great freedom. And he himself was a very successful person. He was born to a fairly affluent family and rose to a very prominent journalistic position. He was an opinion setter. He had a big platform. Because of that, he also understood the kind of glass ceiling that a lot of successful Jews like him experienced in this relatively open, liberal, and accepting society of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, and was very frustrated by that and was moved to think of creative ideas for solving this Jewish problem. One of the solutions that Herzl was thinking was mass conversion. He literally suggested that Jews get up on Sunday, dress up nicely, line up at their local church, and wait to be converted. And voila, the Jewish problem is solved. Eventually, he developed a much more complex solution, which was then named Zionism. I want to note, though, that we focus a lot about Zionism because it's very bold, but it was so unusual that, in fact, it was never the favorite solution by the majority of Jews, not then and not now. And most of them, as I said, chose assimilation or immigration. And Zionism just was so bold and wild and bizarre, really, even for Jews, that it really never was a favorite of the majority of them.
Yaron, you've recently published a book called The New Hebrews, which tracks the evolution of what you call a new Jewishness that began around this time. What is this new Jewishness?
I'll answer by a quote from Herzl, who said that right now, we're Jews. When we go to Palestine and establish our state, we'll be Germans, by which he meant we'll be normal, ordinary citizens of an ordinary national entity. So New Hebrews, it wanted to turn Jews into people, not Jews, to make Jews not special. That one of the revolutionary aspects of Zionism is to normalize Jews, to make them simply just one more undistinct group of people. It sounds funny when you say this, but it's really revolutionary thinking about Jewish history. So it started most distinctly in the second wave of Jewish immigrants or settlers who came to Palestine in the early part of the 20th century, and now very self-consciously under the banner of Zionism, with the intent of establishing a community there that would eventually turn into a Jewish national sovereignty.
In this kind of cultural movement, this idea of building a new Jew who was living in a non-European environment, how much were they motivated by those negative stereotypes that you mentioned, such as Jews being weak, Jews being unmanly? And what did they do to try and combat those stereotypes?
They were very much slighted by that. It's really interesting to see the psychological way Jews first in Europe started fighting this. They did so by focusing on two ancient military leaders, Judah Maccabee, who led the Jewish revolt in the 2nd century BCE against the Seleucids in Judea at the time, and managed to defeat them and establish a Jewish kingdom that lasted for about 200 years. And the second one was a much more problematic fellow called Simon Bar Kokhba, who led the Jewish revolt against the Romans in the 2nd century CE. And that adventure was probably the most disastrous adventure in the history of the Jews, because the Romans were so annoyed with the resources that they had to divert to suppress the rebellion that in the process of this unsuccessful rebellion, around 600,000 Jews died. That disastrous fellow was resurrected by some Jewish groups as an image of Jewish heroism, bravery, etc., and became a very central figure for these sort of psychological resurrection or compensation for these feelings of inferiority. And so in the 1920s, the Zionists who started in Palestine, in the Jewish community there, also created a festival that became a major festival in his honor, in which military games were made part of the holiday program. Particularly, children were simulating some ancient warfare by playing with bows and arrows. And so his image was cultivated as this national freedom fighter. And interestingly, these kinds of reactions to anti-Semitism became very prominent in an area, i.e. Palestine, where the resistance to Jews was very different. It wasn't the kind of anti-Semitism and rejection that they experienced in Europe. And then it became, of course, transformed into the growing need to protect from Arab resistance within Palestine, and became channeled into militarism per se.
So this arrival of these Jews in the area didn't go down particularly well with the local Palestinians. What was going on in response?
The Jewish settlement of Palestine until 1948 was on land that was legally bought from Arab landowners. And for that reason, a military was not thought of as necessary. You buy the land, it's yours. You can do whatever you want with it. The problem was more complicated because on that land that was bought lived for centuries tenant farmers who rented the land from the landowners. And when the new owners, the Zionists, came and bought the land, they asked those tenants to leave. That really is the beginning of the Palestinian refugee problem. There were intellectuals and writers who very specifically said, listen, what we're doing is very problematic. What we're doing is going to come to bite us. We need to understand that we are causing a big problem by this people movement, and we have to address it. But the majority of Zionists were not interested in that, didn't listen to that, and didn't heed that. And so it just escalated. The Palestinians would resist Jewish development. They progressively staged bigger and more violent resistance. In the beginning, it was more local and had to do with immediate neighbors. So, for example, either disenfranchised farmers or, more often, Bedouins who resided in various areas around which Jews bought farms and were used to graze the land more freely, and the new owners were not really agreeing to that anymore. And so the initial animosity was more property rights and stuff like that. But it very quickly escalated into an increasingly more national conflict. What happened is, just as the Israeli nation was beginning to form, the Palestinian nation began to form. These two nations really developed a pace in reaction to one another. And the consciousness of the Palestinians as we know it today, it had old roots, of course, but as a political project that was defined and resembled the Zionist project began to grow at the same time. And these property tensions eventually escalated into a more national fight that became more sophisticated in terms of rhetoric, in terms of politics, and then in terms of military action.
And how did the Jewish settlers respond to the resistance, to the attacks?
So at first, they established a security organization that would send young people to guard farms. By the way, these sort of guarding services were provided by local Arabs and other minorities in the area in the 1880s and 1890s, and they were eventually replaced by Jewish guards or security guards. At first, it was this sort of like property security. But as the resistance grew and spread, this security organization that was established eventually became the kernel of what we eventually know as the Israeli army, because they became bigger, more complex, more widespread, and more organized until they became a militia called the Haganah. And in 1948, the Israel Defense Forces that we know today.
And what military examples from the past did these guards look up to?
This is really interesting because the two cultural icons that became emblematic for these new Jewish guards, the security guard, were the local Bedouins. In the 19-teens and the 20s, Zionist Jewish settlers looked up to them as fighting men and mimicked them. They adopted Arabic, certainly as much as they could. They were wearing the keffiyeh, the headdress. They were riding horses like them. They were putting, belts of bullets around their chest, really imitating the local Bedouins, wanting to be like them. But the other one is completely crazy. The Cossacks of Ukraine. The Cossacks, as part of their own fight for independence, engaged in a lot of pogroms and a lot of attacks on Jews in Ukraine. And they were a menace to Jewish communities. And they, in the Jewish imagination, they were really demonic figures of hatred and persecution and violence. And those guards also wanting to adopt that image of the Cossack as something to look up to because they are freedom fighters, they ride horses, they are very brave and fearless. And so these two, a local one, but they found in Palestine, and a local one they remembered from Eastern Europe, combined into making them this kind of hybrid, with the Cossack having an advantage eventually because of the growing animosity towards Arabs. From the very beginning, these security organizations, they didn't just protect, they also provoked fights with Arabs. When they were established, they adopted as their slogan words from a poem that was written after the 1903 Kishinev pogrom in the Ukraine. And it says, "In blood and fire, Judah has fallen. In blood and fire, Judah shall rise again." So from the very beginning, they had a very combative and very belligerent kind of nature that eventually developed under the growing adversarial relations with the Palestinians. So this spirit of defiance eventually transferred to greater parts of the Jewish community. And it was like a cycle because the more the resistance by the local Arabs grew, the more threatened members of the Jewish community felt, and the more reliant they were on these protective forces. And they then eventually were moved to their side and adopted their spirit of defiance.
Coming up, how the murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis in the Holocaust influenced Israel's military identity in the years that followed.
What are you going to have? Can I have 2 pieces of mullet, please? A piece of sea perch and 8 whiting fillets, please, Pauline.
From a fish and chip shop in regional Queensland
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
to the heart of Australian politics, this is the unlikely story of the country's most controversial minor party.
Are you xenophobic? please explain?
For 30 years, One Nation and Pauline Hanson have been ridiculed, dismissed and shut out.
Gone. I don't like it. No, I don't. Never did.
Now, no one's laughing. One Nation continuing to surge in the polls.
Dramatic surge in support for One Nation.
The fringe becomes the mainstream.
This is the story of how a party built on fear and grievance thrived, died, and rose again to upend Australian politics.
Well, I'm back.
Hanson 2.0 is the serious, strategic, experienced, battle-hardened political operator that we see in the news today.
I'm Ashlyn McGee. This is The Making of One Nation from The Conversation, and you can search for it wherever you listen to podcasts.
So, Yaron, by 1948, the State of Israel was born after the violent displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians, known as the Nakba to Palestinians. At the same time, Israel was encouraging Jewish people from outside the region to migrate to Israel, particularly those who'd survived or escaped the Holocaust. How were those newcomers received?
When they initially came to Israel, they were received materially very well. Emissaries from Israel were sent to Europe to gather them, collect them, agitate amongst them, even those who wanted to emigrate to the United States, to come to Israel. And so the state, the newly established state, was very keen on bringing them over and tried to provide for them when they got to the country materially, housing, food, etc. But on an emotional, psychological level, there was a reluctance to engage with their experience because, by and large, the Holocaust, to the minds of Zionists, vindicated their own ideology because they said, we told you not to stay in Europe. We told you that you will be eventually not meet a good fate. You didn't listen to us. We did the work for you. We established a state. We're bringing you over, but don't talk to us about what you have been through because we don't want to hear about it. It's precisely what we're fighting against. But I have to say that the survivors themselves initially were also very reluctant to speak about what happened to them because they were, in addition to being completely fatigued, traumatized, etc., it's not very pleasant to speak about such horrible things that are done to you. And there was a period of about a decade whereby these kinds of experiences were neither sought by Israelis nor offered by the survivors. And it's interesting, the designation of a Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel, which is not called Holocaust Day, it is called Holocaust and Heroism Day, because the Zionists wanted to emphasize the military resistance to the Nazis in various ghettos around occupied Europe. But interestingly and ironically, over the years, and the first change began with the Eichmann trial in 1961, where it was staged as a public trial.
אתה אדולף, בנו של אדולף קרל אייכמן. אתה מואשם בפני בית משפט.
From that moment on, a very profound change happened to Holocaust memory in Israel, whereby the early Zionist defiance that I spoke about before incorporated also a Holocaust narrative of victimhood. And there started a really problematic combination of defiance, aggression, and a sense of victimhood. And it's a very explosive and lethal combination. A person who was bullied for hundreds of years becomes a bully themselves in a really psychologically problematic process whereby the Holocaust narrative of victimhood is incorporated into the earlier Zionist narrative of defiance, which initially meant to be very, very different to the kind of aggressive militarism that characterizes Israel today.
What predominant symbols and Jewish myths have been repeated in recent months as Israel embarked on a huge military escalation in its war against Iran and Lebanon?
I translated a short paragraph from one of Israel's major dailies that was published a few days into the war with Iran. Who would have believed that the smoke rising over the skies of Auschwitz would, in a short period of time, in historical terms, become air superiority over the skies of all of Iran? Who would have believed that within 2 or 3 generations, Zionism would transform from a marginal movement into the hope of the free world? Who would have believed that from the low point where we feared our own shadow, meaning the Holocaust, would be turned upside down to the point where we would stand tall, raise our heads, and smite our enemies? Who would have believed such a total transformation from passivity, despair, and containment to activity, initiative, and determination? From the ashes of the Holocaust to a people standing at the forefront of the struggle for its future and for the future of the entire West.
Why is it significant to you?
This person is combining utmost victimhood of the Holocaust with utmost aggression. And that is precisely what I meant when I said this combination is so explosive, because you have a country with a very powerful army that's going around thinking it is a victim. It is powerless. It is still a persecuted Jew in the Holocaust.
Thank you so much, Yaron. It's been a deep and historical conversation. I appreciate it and all your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more about the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East on The Conversation, and we'll put a link in the show notes to some further reading. This episode was produced by Mend Marawani and Katie Flood, and I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. Sound mixing is by Eleanor Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com, and please do also rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It really helps us reach new people. Thanks for listening.
We searched for stories from the remote corners and vast landscapes of the Amazon to the beaches and outback of Australia. And after talking for more than 40 hours to almost 30 scientists and field researchers, we discovered what scientists in the 2 largest countries in the Southern Hemisphere are doing to mitigate the effects of climate change.
What I have learned, I learned for life.
I'm Luciana Julião, environmental editor of The Conversation Brazil. Over 5 episodes, our team and I went wide and far to speak with academics from leading research centers and indigenous peoples in Brazil and Australia. We were able to discuss the problems and possible solutions on diverse subjects, such as coastal regions, wildfire, forest management, agriculture, mining, and renewable energy. And we were able to understand what those experts are doing and what can still be done before we reach the point of no return. Voices from the South, Brazil and Australia in the fight against climate change is the first podcast production from The Conversation Brazil, and you can listen to it on our website or on your favorite audio platform. The show is a co-production made by The Conversation Brazil with the support of the Council on Australia-Latin American Relations and strategic consulting from The Conversation Australia. Don't miss it.